Well, welcome to the 2020 budget breakfast. And my name is Stephen House. I'm the director of the Development Policy Centre, and I will be presenting our aid budget analysis this morning. But I want to stress that it's a team effort, and I want to thank my colleagues, in particular Ashley, Betteridge, Sherman, Surendaran, and Terence Wood for their work on putting this analysis together, and of course Ari for organising the webinar. To begin, let us acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional land we are meeting and living, and pay our respects to their elders past, present and emerging. We've been running this aid budget breakfast for several years now, since at least 2013, if not earlier. And this is, of course, the first time we're doing it virtually, so it's a bit of an experiment, but we'll see how we go. I thank you all for tuning in and watching us, whether you're on the webinar or watching the live stream on YouTube. And I encourage you all to submit any questions you have or comments through the Q&A. If we have time, we'll also have a sort of oral Q&A session at the end. But please do submit your comments using that Q&A icon, and I'll keep an eye on that. Before I start, I do want to say that I think for the last couple of years, we have used this opportunity to go beyond the aid budget per se. Definitely we start with that. So if that's all you're interested in, then you can leave after we've covered that. But, there is, as interesting as aid, as important as it is, there's a lot more to development than simply government aid. So as with last year, we will be going beyond the aid budget to look more generally. It's an opportunity for us to share some of our research on development issues and to look at the international development challenges Australia is responding to or needs to respond to. Okay, so let's get started. Of course, we have a PowerPoint, and I'll share that with you. So you should all be able to see the PowerPoint on your screen. Just to advertise ourselves, this is actually our 10th year of our Development Policy Centre. If you like what we do, if you find this kind of analysis useful, please do consider supporting us now or in the future, because we definitely need that support to keep going through these difficult times. So here's the structure for this morning. As I mentioned, I'm going to start on government aid, then actually go and talk a little bit about recent analysis volumes for NGO aid. I know a lot of you from the NGO sector, that's a very important channel of Australia's development effort. Then I'm going to step back a bit and look at the global context, look at what other donors are doing, and look at the really critical debt situation that we're in now and the responses to that. And then circle back to Australia and look at the Beyond Aid agenda. So let's start off with Australian government aid and volumes. And before we dive into the new aid numbers, just to look at the context. Here's Australia's aid in international perspective. This is some work Terence did. We are definitely one of the less generous donors. Especially when you adjust for GDP per capita. The richer you are, normally the more generous you are. In fact, we're in the less generous club, and once you adjust for income, GDP per capita, I think we're the third least generous donor. So that's a sort of sad situation that we found ourselves in over the last few years after successive aid cuts. And then the other important bit of the context is, of course, the budget situation. For those who've been to previous breakfasts, as you'll all know, right, Australia's been running deficit budgets. That's been seen as a challenge for this government to reduce. But now along comes COVID, and we're heading for record deficits this year. So it's a very different fiscal situation than earlier budgets. Now the deficit's not a problem. And, you know, underlying it, you can really see what's going on. This is total revenue and total expenditure, so nothing to do with aid. You see revenues taking a bit of a dip, you know, as you'd expect with all the lockdowns and reduced economic activity. But the real driver for the deficit is a massive increase in expenditure to fund programs like JobSeeker, JobKeeper. So how did aid fare in this overall context? So this is aid in this year's budget. We didn't get any revised estimates for last year. Normally we would. But so for 2019-20, we're still dealing with the budget estimates, and the budget estimate is 4.044 billion. And we're now, the budget estimate for this year is 4 billion, but then there's a supplement of 211 million, yeah, which is actually made up of a couple of programs. The larger one is one for economic recovery. It's about 305 over 2 years, and then there's a smaller sort of health COVID program, which is about I think 25 over 3 years. But just looking at this year, those two programs come to 211. Now, the way the government presented the budget, it said, well, the aid budget is 4 billion, and then we got the supplement on top. That doesn't make a lot of sense because the supplement is also aid. It's grants and it's for development, so it definitely counts as aid. So we're saying that our aid for this year is for 0.211 billion. You know, why did the government present it in this way? Perhaps it wants to be tough on, seems still to be tough on aid. It doesn't want there to be any narrative that it's actually increasing aid at this time of you know, domestic economic distress. And it probably doesn't want to build in expectations that aid is going to increase in the future. In fact, another disappointing thing about the budget information, we don't have forward estimates updated, but you get the impression the government's pretty comfortable with this 4 billion figure. So it's an odd presentation, but when you look at the substance of it, we did actually get an increase in aid this year. It's not a massive increase, it's about 4% compared to last year, but it is the first budgeted aid increase since the coalition came to power. And I think it was definitely unexpected. I think people were thinking that if the aid budget wasn't cut, that would be a victory. In fact, it's been increased. So it was a welcome surprise. Stepping back, this is the trajectory over the coalition's successive budgets, including forward estimates from last budget, because we didn't get forward estimates with this budget, but assuming they still look high. You can see the little uptick this year. It's a bit less the following year and even less the year after. We don't see, you know, every budget being cut, but where we see an increase, like here in 2018-19, it wasn't intentional really. It wasn't in the budget, it was later announcements. It was a kind of timing issue around some multilateral commitments. So yeah, the more you step back, the less it seems like a huge increase, but it is still significant in that it is a deliberate budgeted increase. Looking back even further over the historical record, this is the aid to GNI adjusted for inflation. And yeah, it's a little blip here. So certainly, you know, nothing that reverses the very large cuts we've seen since 2013. And when we look at ODA to GNI, again, we see a little pickup here. Partly, of course, GNI has fallen with the COVID recession, but we calculate the aid to GNI ratio at 0.22. So it is a little pickup, but if nothing else happens, it will continue to fall. And then the last graph, I guess the most sobering one of all, is that when you compare aid not to the size of the economy, but to the total amount of government spending, you certainly see a huge drop-off. Because if you remember from that early graph, massive increase, about 30% in spending, whereas a modest increase, 4% in aid. So aid to total spending is at an all-time low. It's set to increase slightly as some of that big spending is wound back, but it's not going to recover, and it is at an all-time low right now. So, I think your view on the budget depends on what perspective you take, but I do want to end, just reiterating that the budget announcement actually, although confusing, I think does exceed expectations. It is an increase. It's something to build on and something to advocate for in coming years, but also something to get clarity on. I mean, it will be very confusing if the government continues to insist that this aid is not really part of the aid program. Of course, it is up to governments. Governments do have discretion as to what they report as ODA to the OECD, but it would be very unusual, if it's money given by the same department, it's really the same sort of thing. And well, this amount is aid and that amount is not. It's going to confuse everyone. So I think clarity will be a challenge going forward. All right, so that's it on aid volumes, and I'll keep going on to aid allocations and then look at the Q&A, because I think the allocation story and the volume story can only really be understood together. So this is moving on to country allocations. I think what stood out for me is just this massive and continuing steep rise in the share of the aid program going to Pacific and Timor-Leste. It was interesting that this 305 million supplement over 2 years is for Pacific and Timor-Leste, and increasingly we are seeing Timor-Leste grouped together with the Pacific, which I think makes a lot of sense. So that's what I've done now, and I've allocated that supplement to the region, and you can see that it's now above 40%. It's much higher than it's been since the 90s. So it really is the driving force of the reshaping of the aid program. So how was this increase to Pacific and Timor-Leste financed? Well, this is the sad news, the continuing story of cuts elsewhere. So if we take out Timor-Leste, the rest of Southeast Asia is flat in nominal terms, but other regions really copped it. So South and West Asia are cut by 27%. This is all compared to budget estimates last year, nominal terms. Some big cuts. Afghanistan by 35%, Pakistan 66%, Middle East and North Africa 61%, Sub-Saharan Africa 48%. So it's a massive cuts, but when you look at the amount of money freed up, it's not that large. And that's because these regions have already been cut year after year. So these cuts only freed up 180 million. The government needed to cut 44 million to bring the aid budget down to 400. There was some extra money needed for global programs. I think that's that amount goes up and down depending on replenishment schedules, and there's the additional vaccine commitment. So that left only 63 million for Pacific and Timor-Leste extra, and that's a pretty small amount, right? Especially in a time of crisis, and really wasn't enough. And I think that's what drove this the supplement and the aid increase. Right? Finally, the sort of realization that if we really want to have a Pacific step up, we can't. That's not going to be consistent with just keeping that such a tight lid on the aid program. Eventually, something's got to give, and we saw it this budget. It's starting to give with the 4% increase in overall aid. And this graph tries to explain that with the sort of, you can break the aid program down into Pacific and Timor-Leste, East Asia, other regions in the blue, and global. And you can see, well, everything has been cut, right? And there's not much left in the rest of the world to cut. It's pretty small now. East Asia, it's already been cut, and we probably don't want to cut it anymore. Global programs have been cut, we probably don't want to cut them anymore. But we want Pacific to keep increasing, and so we need to increase the aid program. If we hadn't increased overall aid, we would have just seen a very marginal increase in Pacific aid. So I think that's the story underlying the aid increase and the link between allocations and the aggregates. Just going on to some of the other sort of headlines in terms of allocations. In terms of humanitarian aid, you might remember the government's got this commitment of 500 million to humanitarian in the white paper, which was several years ago now. It still hasn't got there, but it is inching closer and closer, and it's saying that the humanitarian aid is going to be up to 476, sorry, that should be 476 million, of course. So I think that's good news, but I think there's some worrying signs when you look at how that humanitarian aid is being spent. We see reductions in global humanitarian partnerships, for example, the Red Cross and World Food Programme, but then we see a big increase in what's called Humanitarian Emergency COVID-19 Response Fund from 150 to 200 million. And of course, COVID-19 is an emergency, but the suspicion is that this is an amount that will again go to the Pacific. How is this money different from other aid spending for economic recovery and health? So it looks like the humanitarian program, on the surface is going up, but the risk is it's actually being subverted, if you like, to actually support the Pacific step up and not being directed to areas where there are really severe humanitarian emergencies that we need to respond to. I don't have a slide on it, but also another feature of the budget, most central programs were cut, including disability, as has been noted in the response to the budget, but there was a small increase in the Central Gender Fund, and of course the Central Health Fund went up. That's really it on this year's budget. Just to finish off this section with a few findings from earlier years. The government has released recently its statistical summary for 2018-19, so we do have an extra year of data to look at, and really no surprises. This is the delivery of aid by partner, and you can see continued dominance of multilateral delivery. It's up to 45%, and continued reliance on commercial contractors. Right? The facilities model almost up to 25% now. NGO aid slight decline. Just to zero in a bit on this multilateral aid, because that's, it is controversial. It's so large, so much larger than any other modality. But just to put it in international context, it's certainly not excessive. In fact, by international standards, we are not a major user of the multilateral system or major funder of the multilateral system. We're in fact the 7th smallest. Other countries tend to put a lot more of their aid through the multilateral system. What we do, where we're unusual, is that we use the multilateral system for earmarked funding, especially to spend in Asia and increasingly the Pacific. But even when you add in that earmarked funding, we're still the 7th smallest in terms of our share of aid going to multilateral. So anyway, people have their own views on this, but just from an international perspective, it's certainly not, we don't stand out. And in terms of who we're supporting, it's mainly the multilateral development banks, which get at least half of our multilateral aid. And just to bring you up, in terms of recent multilateral replenishments, Global Fund and Gavi, we both increased, but again with a flat or only now modestly, or no extra money for multilateral aid, basically, because the extra money is all going to the Pacific. It was interesting to see in the recent World Bank IDA replenishment that we really scaled back our support. Finally, on strategy and performance, I don't have a lot to say, but as I'm sure you all know, there is now a new strategy and performance framework in place. There's a lot of, I think, positives in those documents, in particular, the promise of more support for critical services and more funding of local organisations. So it'll really be a question of how that is executed and monitored. On the downside, the last performance of Australian Aid report is from 2017-18, and we haven't seen any more recent one. I don't know if there will be one. And the Office of Development Effectiveness has been abolished, as has the external committee that provided oversight for its work. So certainly evaluation has been downgraded. There has been an audit of these commercial facilities by the ANAO. I'll just leave the link there for you. Okay, so that's the material on the Australian Aid budget. And there are a few questions here. So let me just briefly turn to these. I could see most people, I think if I click on the answer live, you can see it in your own Q&A. Yeah, most people are interested in the supplement, whether it's going to DFAT staff. I think even if it goes to DFAT staff, that's still counted as ODA, right? If they're working on the aid program, that is still ODA reportable. So I don't see that as a problem in itself. And yeah, Mark Rice asked a very good question. Normally, countries would seek to maximise the ODA. So why aren't we? And I think it goes to that point that we don't want to be, the government doesn't want to be seen to be increasing aid. It's worried about attacks from the likes of Pauline Hanson, that we shouldn't be increasing aid, charity begins at home, that sort of thing. But it is going to add a lot of confusion to both aid programming and to aid discussion if we can't even agree on what our ODA is. Tess has asked what that supplement's actually going to be spent on. Yeah, or I don't have any more information, and it hasn't been allocated to countries. So we've just allocated it to the region because we know it will be allocated there, but it hasn't been allocated to countries. Tess points out it is providing air connectivity, and I guess that is an essential service, and I guess it builds on the Pacific Corridor. Yeah, Misha, yes, the 23.2 million, that is new money. So that is a second supplement, as I understand. That's the main one is the 305 over 2 years, but this 23 over 3 years is another supplement that's not included in the 4 billion. Any funding for Global Climate Fund? There's, we only had 4 pages of budget materials, so it was pretty sparse last night. Climate partnerships fall from 25.7 to 20, but that's I guess a small fragment of the total that we spend, so it's hard to answer that question, Nick. Yeah, Amanda's asking about how much of the health supplement we're spending on vaccination. So my understanding, there's a separate 80 million to buy the vaccine. That is included in the 4 billion, or at least over several years, right? So whatever part we're going to spend this year, which may not be very much, because the vaccine's got to be ready, but that is included in the budget. But this additional 23, I think, is around more the support Australia can provide to help actually get, not just buy the vaccine, but to deliver it. Dan Evans is asking, what are the 2 things we need to do to get the government to increase ODA? Well, I mean, the government has just increased ODA. So for everyone who's been advocating for an increase in ODA, you should give yourselves a pat on the back. I mean, the government has just increased ODA, even though it's saying it hasn't, right? It's an odd situation, but it has. And I think, you know, we need to build on this. And I guess this kind of idea that at least for the government resonates in our region, that at this time of crisis where we're spending so much more domestically and we're saying it's a huge crisis internationally, that we're in, to be credible, we've got to back that up with new money. Yeah, Indonesia, I haven't gone through the individual country allocations, but I mentioned that once you take out, once you take out Timor-Leste, there's no increase for Southeast Asia, and that applies to Indonesia. So it's at it was at $2.99 last year, and it's at $2.99 this year. Why was ODE abolished? Yeah, you'd have to ask that to DFAT. I guess it could be seen as a cost-saving measure. I think there was an idea that their strategic evaluations weren't very useful, that they took too long and were too expensive. But yeah, I think ODE was a champion of evaluation, and so was the Independent Evaluation Committee. And it's unfortunate. And there is still going to be an evaluation function, but it will lack the sort of heft of ODE. Jonathan's asking what's happening to country aid, you know, because of COVID, and obviously there are changes. We didn't get any information about that. The strategy, you know, was announced a couple of months ago, and the next step is for these for the COVID response plans to come out. So it's hard to say what the changes are. Within these headline numbers. So yeah, allocation for Indonesia, I think we've answered that. Absorbing the supplement. Well, yeah, see, they don't have to absorb the supplement, Amy, because it is budgeted for, so it's not coming out of the 4 billion. It's on top of that, and but I guess you're right. I mean, maybe the point, the valuable point you're making is that yeah, they're not going to actually cut aid to the Pacific, right, after 21, 22, and so then if they stick with a 4 billion or 4.1 billion, then yeah, what's going to give? Yeah, that's a good question. So I think it's, you know, that there's a challenge there. I guess that's always been the challenge, or for the last few years has been the challenge, because of this relentless rise in, if I can just show you again, you know, this really is a remarkable graph. I think I was quite surprised, right? This remarkable rise in the share of aid to the Pacific and Timor-Leste from under 25%, just around 2013-14, and 5-6 years we're now above 40%. So everything's had to give to finance that increase, the thick red line, in the context of a major aid cut. I mean, it's remarkable, and that's why you see everything else falling. And if they want the red line to keep going up, then there are just two choices: either total aid has to go up, or they're going to, you know, get rid of aid to Africa, and they'll have to cut aid to the World Bank again, and so on. Sarah's asking, increasing problems with transparency. Yeah, I guess this was a special budget. It certainly was disappointing not to get revised estimates for last year, not to get forward estimates going forward. And I guess the test will come in the next budget. Certainly hope that it'll be back to getting those forward estimates. Rod's asking, is this what we were expecting? And no, so I'm trying to say, Rod, it's better than I was expecting. I don't think many people were expecting that there would actually be an increase in aid. So it's better than I was expecting. It's unfortunate there have been these massive cuts that we're cutting Afghanistan from 82 million to 54 million. in order to finance increases in aid to Tonga and Samoa, which are relatively stable and relatively prosperous countries compared to Afghanistan. So that's unfortunate, but we knew that. I mean, the government had been flagging that for quite a while. So the aggregate increase, I think, is definitely a positive and not what I was expecting. Yeah, on the allocation on disability, if you can't see that in the 4 pages, but it came up in the budget briefing, and I'm not actually sure of the numbers, to be honest, but maybe others can inform us of that. Well, look, I might go on to, I know there's some more questions, thank you very much, just because we're going to run out of time, and I want to, I've only got through the first section. So if you don't mind, I might just hold these questions and go on to the next part of the presentation, and then we'll come back. So yeah, I want to leave the budget a little bit behind and go on to look at NGO aid, because that's a very important part of Australia's development effort. Now, of course, COVID is a major challenge for NGOs in a number of dimensions, but including fundraising. We don't have fundraising information, for this year, but we do have. We can bring you up to date on sort of the pre-COVID situation in 2019 at least. So ACFID collects information on all funds raised with all ACFID members. We do a exercise on just the top 15 or the top 14, and this is the top 14 back in, I think, 2003. So we're not picking winners. We're not picking the best ones now. And the advantage of doing the top 14 is that it's going to be more timely. We can get the information out more quickly. And you can see it tracks pretty well, right? The trend. The top 14 are a good predictor of the total donations raised. And you can see, unfortunately, 2019, we see a 4th year of declines in public donations. So I'd be pretty confident that when we get the full data from ACFID, we will see a similar kind of result. I should mention this also includes MSF and Compassion, which are 2 large NGOs not in ACFID. I think also sobering is that, we need to look not just at fundraising, but at expenditure incurred to raise those funds. And we have seen a sort of arms race in fundraising expenditure, which are these columns. Again, this is just for the top 14, but I'm sure this would hold more widely. So while we are raising a lot more than we did before the tsunami, we're also spending a lot more to get that money. And in fact, you can see that that has now flattened out because we're not getting the return on that fundraising expenditure that we used to be. When you take that out, which is what we call net donations, you can see we're actually, we're of course going down, but actually heading back to the pre-tsunami level. So, this is very sobering, I think, and it does speak to the mood of the Australian people. And it's, it's not clear how this will be reversed. And then just to, another thing that's useful to look at, although again, useful to look at is government funding to NGOs. We get that from DFAT, but there's always the suspicion or the unknown in DFAT that maybe the money going to contractors is ultimately passed on to NGOs, because a lot of NGOs work under these facilities. So it's also useful to look at how much aid NGOs are reporting. And again, when we look at the top 14, we do see that as being in decline. So I think that decline that you see from DFAT is a sort of real decline. It's not just a change in channels. All right, so that's just a bit of a note on NGO funding. I want to go on because we're going to start to run out of time and sort of totally change tack, or largely change tack, and just step back and look at the global context before we return to Australia. So what is happening? What are other donors doing? in terms of their aid budget. We haven't done a comprehensive analysis. It's still, a kind of moving feast, but we can see there are three responses. There are donors who are actually cutting aid, and the UK is in this category. They have a target. Their aid's going to be 0.7% of their GNI. Their GNI or their GDP is falling significantly because they're in a massive depression, so they're cutting aid. Then there are which is our sense, most donors are in this category, which is where we thought Australia would be, and where New Zealand is, where France is, that of course, they have to respond to COVID, but they're doing that by reallocating funding. And then there are those donors who are actually increasing aid. Of course, that doesn't mean they're not reallocating, but there is some incremental increase. And after last night's budget, it's good to see Australia is in that category. And Canada appears to be in that category. And Canada, to a much greater extent, is increasing its aid budget to finance the international response to aid, much more than we are. Our figure is 200. If we were going to do what Canada was doing, we'd have to increase our aid program by 500. It's very interesting to see in Canada there is that discourse, at least, that there should be some response at the international level. Some proportion of the domestic response should be there at the international level. So increase domestic spending by 100, you should increase international spending by 1. They're not there yet, but at least there is that discourse. So that's on the aid front. It's a mixed picture. I guess realistically, we're not going to see a massive increase in aid despite the big humanitarian crisis that we're facing. Then the second issue I wanted to go over is debt, because we are facing a debt crisis, and it looks pretty grim. And it comes from the fact that we're in this global depression. But going into the depression, there was a massive buildup of debt service. So this graph is from an OECD document. It shows for the countries that are now eligible for the debt suspension initiative, just how much their debt service had increased. And, look, the increase all came in 2019. So before COVID came along, they were facing a massive increase in their debt service obligation. I think there's no simple reason for this. Some countries were struggling and so borrowed. It is the era of choice, where you have a number of donors, our official creditors and also private sector creditors who are willing to lend money. But for whatever the reason, you see a massive spike in debt service, and then along comes COVID. So no wonder everyone's worried about a debt crisis. So in response to this, the G20 has launched the Debt Service Suspension Initiative. It's open to 73 countries. Its maximum value is 11.5 billion, but it's a very modest initiative, and it's been subject to a lot of critique. And in fact, you can see it only relates to this part, here, 2020, to this part, and only half of it, because it only started in May. It's highly likely it'll get, rolled over into next year, but even if it does, it's only this bilateral. It doesn't include multilateral aid. Multilateral donors are giving more aid, a lot of it highly concessional or grant, but they're not actually doing any debt forgiveness. And then it's very difficult to arrange private sector debt relief. And even within the bilateral part, this initiative is struggling. So interestingly, only about half the number of eligible countries have actually requested to participate. A number of countries are looking at this initiative. They're thinking, well, I'm actually not going to get that much from it, and it's going to be a black mark against my name. It's going to make me look bad when I want to go out borrowing again. So a number of countries aren't actually participating. Many middle-income countries are not covered by it. And then the other real problem is that although it's a G20 initiative, and China's in the G20, it's being implemented by the Paris Club, which are the OECD creditors. China's not part of the Paris Club, but 62% of this bilateral debt is owed to China, right? So that's a that's a problem. China is now starting to negotiate debt standstills and debt relief, but it's been a slow process, and it's certainly not a coordinated one. Then I think more fundamentally, because stepping back, what you are really interested in is how much are governments able to put into the response to COVID, whether it's from debt relief, whether it's from new external resources, or whether it's from their own taxes or borrowing. And this is actually, I know this looks a bit messy, but this is the best graph I've come across. It's from Fitch, the rating agency, and it tries to measure the response to COVID. And what you notice is that the taller bars are the richer countries, right? US, Canada, Germany, UK, Australia, Japan, France, Italy, Spain. The only developing countries that, I mean, this is obviously only look at the big economies, so it's not comprehensive, but it's only Brazil, Poland, maybe South Africa, that are among the developing countries putting in a big response, a big economic response to COVID. Now, why is this? Again, that's a complex issue, but developing countries face higher interest rates. Their central banks are not as strong. They're more worried about runs on their currency. So I think generally they're more constrained. But so the situation is that the countries that really need the response, right, the countries of poor people, are the countries that are actually providing the smaller response, right? So from a poverty point of view, this is a really bad situation. So that's, I know I'm jumping around a bit, but I want to come back to what this might mean for Australia in our region at the end. So let me come back now to Australia, but looking beyond the Beyond Aid agenda. So at things like debt, that I've just been talking about, but starting with infrastructure, because for us, infrastructure in the AI FFP, that is the immediate Beyond Aid agenda. So I'm not going to go into all this detail, but the first sort of big infrastructure project, not under the AIFFP, but that really inspired the AIFFP, was the Coral Sea Cable. That's now finished. It's having a lot of problems, unfortunately, especially, I can only talk about PNG that I'm familiar with, where it's just not being fully utilized, and we're not seeing the fall in prices that's expected. It's very interesting that the audit office is planning to audit this project, including the development impact. And some of what we're now seeing does go, I don't want to say I told you so, but all along we have been stressing that these big infrastructure projects are much more than engineering or construction projects, that they have to involve policy reform if they're going to be well utilized. So the Coral Sea Cable inspired the AIFFP, I think, and what is now happening to the AIFFP, which is the $2 billion facility, 1.5 lending. It has now announced some projects. It's announced 3 projects, and apparently another 5 have been endorsed. There's still very little information about most of these projects, but from what I've been able to find, these are not big projects. We're looking, for example, at the Solomon Islands. It's a $11 million loan that the AIFFP is going to put into this. So if it's great to see projects coming through. I'm sure they look like they're projects with a lot of potential, but they're not huge projects. And when you compare this to the 1.5 or 2 billion amount in the AIFFP, I think there's still a question mark over whether the AIFFP is needed. And the point we made when it was set up is that actually the Pacific is awash in funding for infrastructure, with massive increases in funding from the ADB and the World Bank, whose prime lending area is indeed in infrastructure. So this is a lead in. What I want to suggest is that we kind of shift our borrowing focus away from infrastructure towards budget support, And I just want to spend a minute talking about PNG, because I think the PNG Australia contrast in our response to COVID really sort of encapsulates the difference that I showed through that Fitch graph, between developed and developing countries and how they're responding. So here in Australia, we are spending 33% more than we did before COVID. In PNG, they're actually spending less, right? They're spending 4%. We're spending more because we're borrowing so much more. We're financing that expenditure through borrowing. PNG is just not able to borrow as much. It's only borrowing 2% more of GDP, but it's also got a massive revenue hit, and hence extra expenditure is falling. And then I think, most telling of all is this cost of debt. PNG took out a 10-year bond to get some of this extra borrowing. It costs 12% a year. Australia, we're almost borrowing now for nothing. I think the latest 10 or 12-year bond, the interest rate's 0.82%. So it's couldn't be more a starker difference between these two countries in terms of the response. And sort of the natural response or flow on from this is, can Australia provide use some of our benefits in terms of ability to borrow very cheaply and help PNG out of this hole. And we have actually been starting to do this last year in a rather unusual way through the Export Credit Agency. Even though it had nothing to do with exports, we did make this $441 million loan to PNG. That loan was for 1 year. It's now been suspended as part of that debt service suspension initiative. And there's going to be a new loan, another loan this year. So I think that's all good. I think where we need to improve is on transparency. Right? This loan has more or less been secret, and it was interesting to see the World Bank really come out in favour of transparency. I think with the growing debt crisis, that's going to be increasingly important. And then the other thing I want to flag is that I feel this kind of one-off, or in this case, it's a 2-year approach. You're not going to achieve very much. We need some sort of longer-term lending program with countries like PNG, maybe Fiji, who are hard hit, who can afford to borrow more at these very low rates. And we can do it with the multilateral banks. So I do think there is a case for Australia. I think it's good that we're entering this space. There's a case for us to do much more. All right, just to finish off, there are a couple of topics I couldn't leave out when looking at the Beyond Aid agenda. Pacific labour mobility is one subject we work on a lot at the centre. Obviously, the pandemic is not a good time for labour mobility, but in fact, we're pretty bullish. We feel the seasonal worker program is now much better known and is being drawn on to meet this harvest shortfall, with already one flight to Northern Territory and other flights planned from Vanuatu or elsewhere. We also think that with the whole aged care crisis and the Royal Commission, there will be more money going into aged care. And one of the priorities will be to get a more stable and trained workforce. And there's a lot of potential for that to come through the Pacific, or from the Pacific, through the Pacific Labour Scheme. And then as we come out of COVID as well, we look to the recovery. The fact that the Pacific has kept COVID-19 largely at bay will mean that the Pacific is a safe place to recruit from. So we may see labour mobility taking off from the Pacific before other regions, and that would help Australia and also help the Pacific. And then finally, I think you can't talk about Beyond Aid without talking about climate change and emissions. And this is, really, I guess, the challenge for the government. This is some work I did earlier in the year that shows this blue line is actually our 2020 target. According to the latest projections, we're not going to hit it till 2030. This was pre-COVID, so we are going to see a reduction this year in emissions, but the question is whether it's just going to bounce back. So clearly, this is an area we need to do a lot more. We are seeing an increasing number of countries sign up for a 2050 net zero emissions target. Of course, the US election will be critical in this regard, but I think we're going to see a lot more pressure on Australia to sign up to this as well. So that's, I know it's been very wide ranging, but I hope you found it interesting. Before I wrap up, let's just go back to Q&A. There are a lot of questions, so maybe I'll just try and go through the questions, and I guess if people want to leave, then of course thank you for coming along, and I'll. But if you want to stay, then I'm happy to keep going beyond the hour. The conclusion is, yeah, just to, I guess, reiterate, it's very good to see an increase in the aid budget, even if it's a sort of hidden increase and it's somewhat confusing. It's unfortunate to see continued aid cuts in areas in need. And then clearly there are very important aid, but also non-aid challenges in the year ahead. Thank you, and do check out our aid tracker, which we've updated in light of last night's budget. Okay, well, going to questions. So Stav Zotalis is asking about advocacy efforts. Yeah, well, obviously there have been 30% cuts since the Abbott days, but this is the first time we have actually seen a budgeted increase. And we could have easily seen further aid cuts, I think, given the current environment. So it's, yeah, I take it as a win, but there's a long way to go. Roxana Khan is asking, yeah, whether it's a mistake to focus on Pacific at the expense of Southeast Asia. If you look at the graph on the rise in aid to the Pacific, yeah, that just seems like fundamental government policies. So it's overall, ultimately, we are, East Asia is a successful region. We're going to see aid to East Asia fall, but yeah, I think it's a very valid question, I'm sort of more worried about the huge cuts in remaining aid program to Africa and to Middle East and to countries like Afghanistan. This doesn't seem to be the time to be cutting aid to Afghanistan. Sadhana's asking, to what extent will aid be used for development purposes? To what extent geopolitical concerns, massive increase for defence and military spending? Yeah, there is a very big defence cooperation program. I think it's about 150 million, mainly focused on the Pacific. And clearly the Pacific step up is driven by geopolitical concerns, and clearly that is going to be a risk for aid effectiveness. Does the Pacific really need increases in ODA? Yeah, that's right. I think the answer is no, Greg. Yeah, Ben Day is asking about the AIIB. I think that's just, I wouldn't read too much into that, Ben. I think that is because, we have to sign up to AIIB. That's our initial contribution to their capital. So I don't think we'll see those big contributions going forward. I think Erin Ryan is providing details on the cuts to disability funding, 12.9 to 9.6 million for central disability programming. So that'll be in the comment section if you want that information. Yeah, same with Misha. Yeah, in fact, several people are on top of that issue. Yeah, Misha's got a good question about conditionality on the PNG budget support borrowing. Yeah, I think that's the lack of transparency that we just don't know the answer to that question. There is now an IMF program in PNG. So we're hoping that with the next line there will be more transparency. But there are lots of risks in PNG, and and I also agree it'd be good to get payments to households in PNG, but at the moment they've got massive arrears. They've got problems paying health workers, so you've got to get the basics sorted out first. And then Mary Wooldridge is asking, what's the impact of the global humanitarian partnership cuts? Yeah, I think that's the point I was trying to make here, that this needs more analysis, but there is a risk that we are moving our humanitarian focus away from the idea of being a good citizen, supporting areas that are in crisis, the massive Syrian refugee problem. The government, I think, is still committed to the Rohingya support, but further afield, I think the warning lights are flashing that if we're cutting we're cutting funding to the Red Cross, we're cutting funding to the World Food Programme, we're cutting funding to the part of the UN that works on Palestine, that we are going to reduce our contribution to those humanitarian crises and increase our funding to COVID-19 crises, which could very well mean increased funding, even more of an increased funding for the Pacific. And so sort of even more of a distortion of the aid program away from something based on a needs-based allocation. So I think that's definitely a risk. Yeah, I think those are most of the answers, most of the questions. So we are out of time. It's 10 o'clock. Maybe I'll stop this sharing. All right, well, I think we're done, and it's right on 10 o'clock. So we might call it a day. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a great day. Bye-bye.